welcome back to the podcast. I'm the host, Sean Boyce. I'd like to welcome my guest to the show today, Derek Osgood, who is the founder and CEO at Ignition. Hello, Derek. How are you? And thanks for being on the show.
Not too bad, Sean. Excited to jam on some stuff.
Same here, man. Very excited for what we have planned to talk about. Before we get into that, if it's okay with you, I'd love for our audience to learn more about your background. So if you can share any of those details with them and take them to how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, sure thing. So my background, basically, historically, I've run, marketing and product marketing teams kind of throughout Silicon Valley. So early on in my career, I was actually in gaming. I was at PlayStation launching big AAA games as a product manager. And then, I've pretty much kind of been in and or around venture-backed startups ever since. So I've, built and managed go-to-market processes in every possible vertical you can imagine at early stage, mid-stage, late stage companies, ranging from like payments and field service management to, mobile app developers for consumers and messaging. I did some fintech stuff. So I ended up joining BBVA, which is a big Spanish bank for anybody who's not familiar, and basically ran marketing across a whole portfolio of companies that we had either created and incubated in-house or, had invested in or acquired. And so we were actually launching not just products, but launching companies. And then most recently, I was running product marketing as kind of an early hire at Rippling, helped them scale up from seed to about 20 million in ARR or so. And basically, I across my whole career, a big challenge at every single one of these companies has just been, figuring out the launch process and figuring out how to actually build a repeatable launch process that uses insights appropriately and actually weaves that into the plans that are being created, coordinating all of those plans across all the different stakeholders involved in the company, both internal and external, and then, announcing that stuff effectively to customers. And that process has always been broken. And so, this is kind of personal pain point. I decided to start Ignition because I had finally had one too many companies that I had created, tried to build out this process by hacking together a whole bunch of different tools and documents, and it just wasn't cutting it. So, I decided that there needed to be a platform around this, and ran out to go start my own thing.
Very cool. And I'm going to have to second or third or however many times upvote exactly what you're working on, because I've got that personal experience myself as well, too. That is a very difficult problem to solve. A lot of companies really struggle with it. So that's why I'm that excited about what you guys are doing over at Ignition. So super cool. I was going to ask you more about that. So thank you for sharing kind of more about the value proposition at Ignition. And I know one of the things we wanted to dive into further here as well, too, which is a big part of that as well in your background, which is product marketing. And This is an area where I've seen a ton of activity in the market. Folks in my network that have product marketing skills get scooped up so fast. I remember making one referral a while back when one of my product marketing friends was hey, I'm looking for something new. Anybody that you might recommend? I made one or two referrals, and by the time I had done that, they were already off the market. So skills have been very hard to come by, and a lot of competition for anybody who has that ability. I would love for you to talk a little bit more about how you define product marketing and perhaps why it's so high in demand at the moment.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I feel like product marketing is kind of at this inflection point where it's sort of where product management was 10 or 15 years ago, where it's now the fastest growing role in marketing. It's the most in demand. I constantly am getting bombarded by people who are asking for referrals to product marketers, since we're selling to them and talking to them on a regular basis. And I think defining product marketing is always tricky because it does vary company to company, and it kind of depends on what your product management structure looks like. But I like to think of this actually through kind of a visual where, I think if you think about the way that products get built, you have the product manager who kind of sits at the center of eng and design and UX research. And they're kind of acting as the interface between all those different teams, as well as the ones kind of going out and collecting customer requirements and then building the kind of top level strategy around products. I think product marketing actually serves a similar function. They're sort of the product manager of the go-to-market process. And so they kind of sit at the center of product and sales and CX and marketing. And they are acting as the voice of the customer to help make sure that the things that are getting built are being communicated in a way that, the customer will actually understand and resonate with. They're also the ones who are really defining, the go-to-market strategy around the products that they manage. And so they're thinking holistically about what is the sales motion that you're using? What is the pricing and packaging of that product? Where is the right market to introduce it to? And so, they kind of act as like, the simple version is like, they're sort of the brains of the operation when you're talking about general marketing strategy and introducing products to customers. But it's a really fascinating role, and it does vary company to company. They're also the ones who end up like doing a lot of asset creation. And I think, if you looked at product marketing 5 to 10 years ago, a lot of them ended up being glorified kind of like deck builders and sales enablement teams. And the reality is like where product marketing is shifting to is what is much closer to my own personal experience with product marketing, which is a much more strategic function that's really driving all the activity of all these other teams that are, executing on, building out the go-to-market itself.
Yeah, that's super helpful to have better context around how to think of product marketing as well as the history, right? And what you shared there, a lot of the heavy emphasis on like go-to-market, GDM kind of component, right? Which is just critical. So important for especially as early stage firms to try to figure out, because it means everything when it comes to try and get some traction, right? So I'd love to hear you talk more about, I guess it probably overlaps to an extent with the value proposition in terms of what you're working on in Ignition, but with all your experience and having done this over and over again, I'm sure folks that are listening in are curious to learn from you in terms of like, what does that process look like in terms of what you figured out when it comes to, doing this work and launching new products? Like, what do you think are the strategies that work? What are the strategies that don't work? I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, so the specific strategies do tend to vary a bit company to company. I mean, there are some really like high level kind of general marketing strategies that you can approach. Whether you're taking like a category creation approach, you're probably going to be creating a lot more educational content to define that's more focused on the problem than on the solution. If you're taking a competitive switching approach, you're probably doing a lot of direct promotion to competitors' users, and you are providing a bunch of discounting to them for switching over. But I think like when you think about go-to-market strategy as a whole, ultimately, most of this comes down to having a process and actually running a process where you are going and collecting research up front that informs the rest of the process. So you need to go and conduct competitive analysis to understand what existing perceptions exist around your product. Then you need to go out and conduct customer research to understand what do your customers actually care about, what are their perceptions around those competitors that you were looking at, and then build out a positioning, messaging, go-to-market strategy based off of the learnings from that process. So when you're thinking about positioning, you need to establish like who you're for, why they should care about you, and what is truly unique and different about your product that makes it 10x better than whatever they're using today. Then translate that into copy, assets, et cetera, that can be used to promote and tell that story and design a narrative around it. And then like obviously there's figuring out distribution plans around what channels you should be focusing on. I think too many companies end up treating the positioning and messaging exercise as an afterthought, and they definitely treat the research portion of this as an afterthought. They haven't done their homework on what customers really care about, and so all their positioning and messaging is focused on like me. It's what did I build and what story do I want to tell to you, as opposed to putting the messaging in the customer's shoes and understanding like what does the customer care about. And that's what happens when you don't do research. But the other big pitfall is that companies end up treating the actual promotional process again as an afterthought. They're like, hey, we're going to, we built this thing. Let's go send an email, and like send one email is the entire way that we're going to announce the new thing that we built to customers or to prospects. And then they're all going to love it and use it, and we'll get a bunch of revenue out of it. And the reality is, like, you need multi-channel touch points. You need a full buyer journey where you're communicating that thing over and over to people, because they won't see your first message, they'll forget about it, they may not be ready to use it and buy it at that point in time. So you really need to make it feel like it's everywhere in order to drive the kind of adoption that you want. And the only way that you do that is if you really go through like a real planning cycle and you actually think about this stuff holistically through the lens of all the different ways that you can communicate it to customers. And then, like, the coordination challenges are a whole different ballgame. It's like different teams in the company need different bits and pieces of information, and it's a huge pain to get that to them. So, that I could go on and on about that bit too, but mostly it's about, have a strategy and like have a planning process that is also repeatable.
Yeah. So there's a lot that you just mentioned. It's really important to get right as part of this process. Otherwise, right, results will vary. It's probably the best way to say it. I've been there myself personally, so I've still got those scars. And there's a couple of things I heard you mention as well too. And there's two questions in particular that I definitely want to dive into. I'll hit the first one first. And that was kind of related to the marketing effort. So perhaps after you've started to do some of the discovery effort, some of the research, and you've got some idea for initial traction, number one, it's awesome that you mentioned to make sure that everything is being positioned from the perspective of the customer, because so often I'm coming across folks that are describing it in the way that they would like to describe it, but it's clearly missing the customer element. I just don't hear those. I don't hear that when they're describing it, right? Like, customer wants this, customer doesn't want that, those type of things. And those can be make or break, right? So really important distinction to make there. But when it comes to investing in different marketing channels, right? You mentioned multiple channels, which I totally agree with as well too. And this is something I've gone back and forth with time to time again as well. Also, in terms of like investing in direct marketing, investing in indirect marketing, thinking it from the perspective of performance, measuring the ROI, tracking the analytics, all these types of things. There's a whole world to kind of unpack there, but I'm curious to get kind of your best advice here based on what you've seen work, because I know that's a big area that folks like to focus in as well too. And a lot of people get lost in it because it's just like, it can get complicated and really diverse fast.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, this is, I could do an entire podcast on this. The reality. So I think we're a lot of like modern marketing teams that are a little bit less kind of experienced with the kind of holistic go-to-market planning motion fall down, is that they end up measuring for impact measuring for efficiency rather than measuring for impact. And what that does is it biases you towards purely focusing on individual channels in isolation and focusing on individual channels. And it really like ends up making direct response marketing look a lot better than some of the indirect stuff. And the right way to think about this is, what does it take in the customer's shoes to motivate them to make a purchase? And so they have a journey. Like, they're not going to, in most cases, they're probably not going to be ready to buy the first time they hear about you. They're not going to go immediately like click an ad that you're running at them. If they do, great. Your ad platform is going to look like it's performing like crazy, but you're probably not motivating any new customers who are not ready to buy in that instance to buy your product. So you have to think about this as a marketing mix. Like, it truly is, all of these channels contribute to each other. And so what you want to have happen is have a real journey where a customer sees or hears you through an indirect channel. Like, maybe you did some PR and you got some press. So they hear about you through that. And then they get hit 2 days later with a direct ad through a search ad that drives them into a piece of content that you're running. And that piece of content educates them more about how that product is going to benefit their life, and, how they get onboarded to it and what their buying process should be like. And then they will finally convert, after a couple of touches. And so you have to think about, you're providing air cover with these indirect indirect channels to build awareness and to just pique people's interest, so that when they do get hit with a direct message, then that direct message has a higher likelihood of converting them into the buyer path that you want them to follow. So you actually have to think of these things as a system, as opposed to thinking of them as like should I be doing direct marketing or indirect marketing? Should I be doing, X channel or Y channel? It's all of these things work together.
Yeah, I really like that take and how you've described it as a system, almost thinking of it like a full marketing experience, right? Where I think one of the really important things you mentioned here is if you're evaluating them from like a channel by channel and you're pitting them all against one another, what you're missing there is the combined effort in terms of them working together to push the mission forward, right? Because like you said, really hard to measure the ROI on indirect marketing, right? Did that work? Did that not work? Well, did we get customers? Did we not, right? Indirect marketing is not necessarily designed to do that, right? Like, why is it so hard for people to forget that Coca-Cola is a popular soda? Because there's billboards everywhere, right? It's like ingrained and burned into our subconscious there's a time and a place where that stuff is like, can be very effective, right? And I think one of the things you described that I like a lot is how that can be so complementary to the direct marketing that you then do, right? So there's a balance to strike there. And it's about figuring out kind of what's the right balance or the most effective version of that, which works well for whatever it is you're trying to do with your product. So I think that's an excellent way to describe it. So another topic I wanted to ask you about as well, too, because I really like your take on it and conversations we've had in the past is thinking through building out your prototype, when to ship, how to start testing, thinking about like the build phase and how far to go. You mentioned kind of a little bit earlier, the like field of dreams approach, right? If you build it, they will come kind of thing. And I've had a lot of experience myself, unfortunately, personally, but also professionally and working with others to know very well that doesn't work. And then even more so, people are always trying to figure out, right, how do I strike the right balance of, when do I build? What do I build? How do I test? At what point do I have enough to really start getting the type of feedback that I'm looking for? And what am I looking for in terms of feedback? So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about your philosophy here as well.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I think generally my advice to most startups is like ship as fast as possible, get people to pay or at least give some kind of investment of time, energy, or social capital if they're not going to pay you dollars upfront before don't build anything until you've actually got some confirmation that like people actually want the thing that you're building. So, our process was exactly that. We went out and we got some companies to commit to using us and being, beta customers before we ever even wrote a line of code. A couple of them ended up being investors, which was another signal where we're like, oh, okay, you're willing to invest your personal money into our vision. That clearly means that there's something here. And then, I think go and build as much as you feel like it takes to deliver some kind of value to them. And so it's about building a series of hypotheses and testing those continuously. Like there is no right or wrong answer on when the right time to ship something is. It's just as soon as you feel like you can actually go learn something that's helpful to you in the next phase of product development. Like with our product, it's funny because I think we haven't really followed the like true kind of lean startup approach. We've actually built a pretty huge amount of platform before we really started even like rolling customers on aggressively or, charging people. So I kind of ignored a lot of my own advice here, but part of that was because we're building for myself as a persona. So like, I knew kind of like where these pain points are and I knew that it was a real problem. But I think we did ship like a very broken version of the product back in, October or so of last year. And we said, hey, like we've got enough built that, we can start testing a couple of the hypotheses that we've got. And let's see if like this lands and if anybody is interested in using this. And it was pretty broken. And like, honestly, a lot of the early like alpha users that we rolled on, like ended up churning. A lot of those people who kind of committed, before we ever started building stuff, ended up churning off. And we're like, okay, cool. Let's go back to the drawing board. Let's do a little bit more iteration. And we built a little bit more. And then we shipped another version that was, again, like a little bit less broken, but still kind of broken in January. And then, learned a bunch of stuff about like what was and wasn't working, because that time we got more people in. That time more people were more deeply invested in using it and testing it. And so we got a little better feedback. And then we, built some more over Q1, and like now we're at the point where we're shipping, like what feels like a relatively robust product, and people are sticking around and using it and liking it. And so you have to like be comfortable with like some people are going to hate it in the beginning and like ship something that's broken. And just make sure that if you're doing that, you're doing it intentionally, and you have like what specific learnings that you're trying to figure out the answers to, and you have an idea of like what constitutes success or failure there, so that you can then optimize around it.
Yeah, it's a really good point. The intentionality element's so important, right? I love the mentality as well too, like shipping fast, right? Failing fast, but learning throughout that process, right? Shipping. I feel like we should all feel much more comfortable shipping broken products, right? Because it's very hard to learn if you're waiting to perfect something, which might never come,
Yep.
and just to get that data and that feedback, right? And if you are, hopefully not way off base, but if you are, and you waited that long and you invested all that time, money, and effort, and it's like, if only I had done this sooner. I've had so many unfortunate conversations with folks where it's like, I spent 2 years going down the wrong path. And it's like, that's the unfortunate outcome that you might unfortunately find yourself at if you don't listen to Derek's advice. It's basically what I'm getting at. And that, like, if you really want to test it, ship it at 75% or whatever, maybe even sooner than that. And then it's almost a form of validation in itself as well, too. If people are willing to use a product with less than ideal experience or something that isn't fully featured yet, right? So if they're willing to jump through more hoops, that's a great sign, right? Is in like, now you really have some indication, or at least some early evidence that suggests you really struck a chord with some folks, or you've hit an area where there's a lot of pain and not a lot of great solutions, because you're willing to use a product that's incomplete. And then, like you said, process of feedback, learn from it, shift a better version, keep making progress, then you'll know it, right? But at least you'll be getting the feedback all the way, which is really a critical element.
At the same time, too, though, like I do think there is some degree of like needing to power through negative feedback. Like you have to be willing, you have to be able to identify, like, is this really feedback that there's not a problem here, or is this feedback that like the product isn't quite solving the problem in the way that I intended it to? And if it's the latter, you need to keep building, because there's clearly a problem. People are willing to like invest some time and energy in giving you feedback because they are emotionally invested in it. But if there's no problem, that's when you need to like hard pivot off into something else.
Good point. That's a key distinction there, right? If folks are frustrated and like want to churn because like product technically didn't create the ideal experience for them, well, that's something you could fix, right? But at the same time, they still wanted it to be able to do that. It just didn't at the moment. Maybe it doesn't, it's suboptimal, or it's like technically broken or whatever. That's an easier fix. But if the value proposition is not getting great feedback, that's a whole other problem, right? And something you need to address sooner. So good distinction there. And then the one of the last topics I wanted to talk about more with you, because of your experience in product marketing and otherwise, is this element of pricing, which is one that is kind of this elusive element of doing all of this work, is to like figure out how to set pricing. I know everyone's got a different take on this as well too, but I'd love to hear your philosophy for our listeners in terms of how they should be thinking about how to price their products, when to start charging for their products, how to update that policy. Any advice you have here as well too?
Yeah, I mean, start charging as fast as you possibly can, again, because it's another good signal in terms of whether or not like the problem is validated. Like if people are willing to pay you for something, even if it's like kind of broken, that's a great signal that you're on the right path. I think like pricing's funny. It's sort of this like, everybody kind of thinks of it as like black magic, and it's like there's some kind of magic to how you figure out like what to charge. There is like a real science to it. It's hard to apply that science until you have a pretty significant, amount of users that you can go out and like actually survey and conduct research with. But generally, the way to do that is you first go conduct packaging research, where you do feature prioritization through it's called like Mac. I mean, you can do conjoint. Conjoint's really complex and expensive, but like MacStiff. There's a bunch of documentation out there about how to do this. It's a fairly simple framework for prioritizing, like figuring out what parts of your product people actually care about the most and should be packaged as like premium features. And then you can do some price sensitivity analysis through, again, there's a couple of other survey methodologies for this. Van Westendorp, David Granger. Again, lots of documentation out there on how to do those, but basically you do those two things sequentially, and then that'll give you a pretty good idea of like what acceptable price points are and how you should be bundling your product. I do think like, the big question these days is like with the rise of product-led growth is like, should I be free, or should I have a free trial, or should I just like charge up front? And I think like we've had some interesting learnings as a company around this. Like we originally set out and we were like going to be fully freemium, and it was like free until you upgrade. And I think, when we were in that, like the product was kind of broken stage, we got a bunch of like false negative data where people were not like, because the product onboarding experience wasn't great, that freemium experience it just looked like everybody was just churning off like crazy. But the reality was that we were just giving too much for free at a point when the product wasn't delivering on the aha moment quickly enough in it early on. So we actually decided to like move off of like a true freemium model for a period of time. I think we'll go back to it eventually, but like now we're like actually charging people pretty much upfront and getting dramatically better engagement, getting dramatically better feedback. We're learning a lot more. So I actually think that, especially in the early days, you should actually charge people, even though and it's counterintuitive because you're like, the product kind of sucks right now. I'm not ready to charge people, but you actually want to charge them earlier and then move free over time, because the product and onboarding experience will get so much better down the road. So I think it's kind of like doesn't totally seem intuitive, but that's one of our big learnings so far.
It's a great point, and it makes a lot of sense when you put it in that context, right? There's a lot of exciting things about product-led growth. I know it's exploded in recent years, and I've got a lot of value for it myself as well too. But to your point, when you're starting something new and the product experience is seemingly like kind of like incomplete or inconsistent to a certain extent, it's going to be hard to leverage that strategy in order to grow potentially. So I like your take better, also because we're trying to get early stage validation, right? Where it's like, just like people using a product where the experience is subpar or less than ideal or whatever, paying for it is a whole other form of validation, right? In terms of like whether or not you're on the right track. So like they usually say, people typically don't vote for things with their checkbook that they don't actually want. But people might jump through hoops or use products, test them, play around with them, watch demos all day, right? Just because they're curious. But when it actually comes time to pay, that's usually a different level of decision and a whole other extra form of commitment. So great point there as well, too.
Yep.
Very cool. Derek, can't thank you enough for being here, man. It's super valuable information. I'm super excited to share this with the audience. So I want to thank you for being here, but I've got a couple of questions for you too before we let you go. The first is, are there any resources that you might recommend where folks can go to learn more about yourself, your work, or anything else that we talked about here?
Yeah, I mean, I think resource-wise, best place to go is honestly the Ignition blog. So, our website's haveignition.com, and then, the blog is linked out to from there. I think, just external resource-wise, I definitely recommend anybody who's interested in product marketing as a discipline, go check out Product Marketing Alliance. They're the best resource out there for new product marketers. But yeah, we're discoverable at, haveignition.com. We're also on Twitter with the same handle. And that's probably where we're broadcasting the most.
Amazing. Thank you. Great recommendations on resources as well, too. We'll link to those in the show notes. And then last question I have for you is, who should reach out to you and how can they get in touch?
Yeah, anybody who is looking for better product marketing in their company, or has a product marketing team that is trying to operationalize their go-to-market process. So, we work with startups that are, super tiny, fresh out of the gate, and they're launching their product for the first time. We also work with, pretty large enterprises that are really trying to operationalize the process internally. And best way to get in touch is haveignition.com is the website. And then, my email is derek@haveignition.com. And, I love to hear from people, even if you're just curious. So feel free to ping me.
That's amazing. Thank you, Derek. I really appreciate you sharing that. We'll link to that in the show notes as well also. And I appreciate you being here to share your knowledge and experience with myself and our audience. Yeah.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a blast.
Very welcome. Thanks for listening to this episode of Product Launch. I hope you got value out of it. I like to feature product people on my podcast because that's who I love to help. I'm a product strategist, and I can help you scale your business and grow your profit through a product. If you'd like to learn more about how I can help you, email me at sean@nextstep.io. That's Sean, SEAN, at nxtstep.io, or visit my website at nxtstep.io. That's nxtstep.io.